Story 1.
It was a quiet night. I had just finished dinner and was lying in bed, casually scrolling through my phone. Suddenly, a notification from the doorbell camera popped up. At first, I thought it was nothing unusual, probably just a passing car or some animal tripping the motion sensor. But when I opened the app, I froze. There was someone standing at my front door. The figure didn't move, just stood there, completely still. My heart started racing as I focused on the image. Who would be standing at my door at this hour? I clicked on the live feed. The person didn't ring the bell, didn't knock, didn't shift or look around. It was as if they were staring directly into the camera, just standing there, waiting for something. It was a woman. She was wearing a long, dark coat with a hood pulled up, completely obscuring her face. Even though the image was clear, I couldn't make out any details of who she was. It felt wrong, unnerving. I kept watching, waiting for her to do something. I assumed she'd knock any second now, or maybe just walk away. But she didn't move. The more I stared, the more I felt a creeping anxiety. Who was she? 10 minutes went by. She hadn't moved an inch. My mind raced through possibilities. Was she lost? Hurt? Or was this some kind of weird prank? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously made my way to the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I unlocked it and slowly turned the handle. I stepped outside, expecting to see her there. But she was gone. The porch was empty. Confused, I looked around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. There was no sign of her anywhere. I went back inside and checked the camera feed again. It showed nothing but an empty porch. Yet, the notification kept coming, telling me someone was still standing there. I stood in front of the door, staring at my phone, unsure of what to do next. The app insisted that there was movement at the door, but I couldn't see anyone. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. A shiver ran down my spine. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the camera was malfunctioning. But the footage had been so clear. That woman had been standing there for 10 minutes, and now she was just gone? I hesitated for a moment, then decided to step outside once more. The night was cold, and everything was still. I looked up and down the street, nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all. I walked back inside, closing the door behind me. My mind was racing. Who was she? Why hadn't she rung the bell or knocked? I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was just a random person passing through. But then my phone buzzed again. Another notification from the camera. I felt a chill creep over me as I opened the app. The same empty porch greeted me, no figure in sight. Yet, the camera kept sending notifications, one after another. It was as if someone, or something, was still there, right in front of my door, staring into the lens. I didn't know what to do. The camera was picking up motion, but nothing was there. I was about to turn off the notifications when a new thought crossed my mind. What if she was still there, and I just couldn't see her? The idea seemed ridiculous, but the anxiety gnawing at my chest wouldn't go away. I double-checked the locks, pacing back and forth in the hallway, glancing at the screen every few seconds. Each time, the camera insisted there was movement outside. Finally, I shut off the notifications. I couldn't take it anymore. But even after closing the app, the uneasy feeling stayed with me, making sleep impossible. The night dragged on, but I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. Every little noise outside made me jump. My mind kept replaying the image of that woman, standing so still, watching my door. Who was she, and why had she come here? Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. But it didn't last long. I woke up suddenly to the sound of a loud thud outside my window. Heart racing, I sat up and listened, but there was only silence. I checked the camera feed again, still nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, despite the silence outside. I couldn't bring myself to relax. That thud had been real, I wasn't imagining it. I threw on a hoodie and grabbed the flashlight again. This time, I wasn't just going to peek outside, I was going to check everything. I slowly opened the front door, shining the light around the porch. Nothing. My eyes darted to the corners of the yard, then the street. It was completely empty, just as before. But something felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I walked around the side of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned the corner, I froze. The back gate was wide open. I knew I had locked that gate earlier. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should go out and check the yard or just go back inside and call the police. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know who, or what, had been at my door. I pushed through the gate and stepped into the backyard, shining my light around. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual shadows cast by the fence and trees. I walked the perimeter of the yard, checking every corner. When I reached the far end, my foot hit something solid. I looked down and saw a single footprint in the dirt. It was fresh, the footprint was large, far too big to belong to the woman I had seen on the camera earlier. My stomach churned. I was no longer just dealing with a strange visitor. Someone else had been here, or worse, still was. I scanned the yard again, this time more slowly. My flashlight's beam flickered for a second, casting strange shadows on the fence. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. There was a faint sound, like soft footsteps, coming from the other side of the fence. Panic gripped me. Whoever it was, they were just outside. I backed away slowly, keeping the light pointed in front of me, and retreated to the house. I locked the back door behind me and pulled the curtains shut. I was shaking as I returned to the living room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who had been in the yard? What did they want? And where was that woman in the hood? Just as I was about to reach for my phone to call the police, another notification popped up from the doorbell camera. My stomach dropped. I opened the app once again, half expecting to see nothing like before. But this time, she was back. The woman in the hood stood in the same spot as before, completely still. She hadn't moved an inch from where I first saw her hours earlier. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen in disbelief. How could she be there again? I had checked outside, and no one was there. My hands shook as I zoomed in on the image, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Her face was still hidden by the hood, her figure shadowed in the dim light of the porch. She hadn't rung the bell or knocked, just like before. I didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct told me to stay away from the door. I moved away from the camera feed, pacing around the house. There had to be an explanation for all of this. Maybe it was a glitch, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after a long night, but as I tried to rationalize it, my phone buzzed again. Another notification. Then another. The camera feed was lighting up with alert after alert. I forced myself to open the app again, hoping the woman would be gone. She was still there. But this time, something was different. She had moved. Not much, just a small tilt of her head, like she was finally looking directly into the camera. My heart pounded in my ears as I realized she was aware I was watching her. I froze, staring at the screen. She wasn't supposed to move. Why now? Why after all this time of standing still? And then, the camera went black, the feed had cut off completely. The app gave me an error message, saying the camera was disconnected. I tried refreshing it over and over, but nothing worked. I was officially blind to whatever was happening outside. My mind raced, trying to decide what to do. Should I go out there and check the camera, or stay inside and call someone? Every instinct screamed for me to stay put, but curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight once again. My hands trembled as I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The air was colder than before, and the silence weighed heavily around me. I shined the light on the doorbell camera, half expecting it to be broken. But it looked completely normal. No damage, no signs of tampering. Yet, the app still showed an error. I scanned the yard again, just like I had done earlier. There was no sign of the woman in the hood. She had vanished once again. But as I turned to head back inside, I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I slowly turned around, shining the light towards the street. At first, I saw nothing. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something in the shadows. A figure standing at the edge of my yard. My heart leaped into my throat. The figure was barely visible, standing just far enough away to blend into the darkness. I could tell it was her. The same hood, the same long coat. She hadn't left. I called out, my voice shaky. "Who are you? What do you want?" But there was no response. She just stood there, watching me. My hands were shaking as I backed towards the door, never taking my eyes off her. I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My heart was pounding out of my chest. What was she doing? I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't want to look. I was terrified of what the camera might show this time. After a moment, I forced myself to check the app. To my horror, the camera had reconnected. And there she was, standing right at the door again. I felt sick. She was closer now, her face still hidden by the hood, but her presence felt overwhelming. I couldn't take it anymore. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. As I explained the situation to the operator, I kept glancing at the feed. The woman hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The police told me they would send someone to check the area. I was relieved, but part of me still felt uneasy. Would they even find her? I sat by the door, waiting, watching the live feed as the woman stood silently. The minutes dragged on. I kept expecting her to do something, move, knock, anything, but she just stood there like a statue. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the flashing lights of a police car outside. I ran to the door, ready to tell them everything, but when I opened it, she was gone. The officers searched the area but found no trace of the woman. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They assured me they would keep an eye on the neighborhood, but there was little they could do without any evidence. I thanked them, though it didn't ease the tightness in my chest. As I watched them drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I closed the door, locking it behind me, and collapsed onto the couch, utterly exhausted. I checked the camera one last time before trying to sleep. The porch was empty, as it should have been. But the sense of unease stayed with me, long after I turned off the lights. The next few nights were quiet. No more notifications from the camera, no sign of the woman. I tried to convince myself that it had been some strange prank or a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew better. Every time I checked the doorbell app, I half expected to see her standing there again. But she never appeared. Life slowly went back to normal, though I never fully relaxed. And then, one night, weeks later, my phone buzzed with a familiar notification. I opened the app with trembling hands, and there she was, standing at my door, as if she had never left.
Story 2.
It started on a Tuesday night. I had just settled into bed when my phone buzzed with a notification from the doorbell camera. It wasn't unusual for me to check it late at night, just in case there was someone at the door. But when I opened the app, there was no one there, only a faint noise, like a scraping sound, just out of frame. I replayed the footage a few times, trying to figure out what it could be. There was nothing on the porch, no animals, no person. Just that faint scraping noise and the soft sound of footsteps. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. But the next night, it happened again. The same strange noise, the same empty porch. The doorbell camera showed movement, but there was no one there. That's when I began to feel uneasy. The following week, the notifications became more frequent. Every night around the same time, I would get an alert about movement at the door. Each time, I checked the camera, and each time, there was nothing but that eerie scraping sound and soft, deliberate footsteps. I started to wonder if the camera was malfunctioning. Maybe it was picking up random noises from the street, or some glitch in the system was detecting movement that wasn't there. I even considered replacing the camera, but something kept me from doing it. I needed to know what was causing those noises. Then, one night, something changed. As I replayed the video, I noticed something strange, a shadow, just barely visible at the edge of the frame. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart race. The shadow was vague, almost like a smudge on the lens, but it moved. It seemed to shift closer with each frame, slowly, deliberately. I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept checking the camera, waiting for another notification, but nothing happened. The porch remained empty, and the shadow didn't return. But the damage was done, something was out there, and I was starting to feel paranoid. A few nights passed without incident, and I began to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But then, late one night, the camera buzzed again. This time, what I saw chilled me to the core. The shadow was back, but this time it was clearer. It wasn't just some blur at the edge of the frame, it had a shape now. A figure, standing just outside the range of the camera's infrared light. It didn't move, but it was there, unmistakable. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I didn't want to go outside, didn't want to face whatever was out there. But I couldn't ignore it either. I replayed the footage, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it only made me more anxious. The figure was there, and it was getting closer. I decided to stay up that night, keeping an eye on the camera, waiting for another movement. Hours passed, but nothing happened. The shadow didn't reappear. I began to wonder if I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The next few days were uneventful. No strange noises, no notifications from the camera. It was almost as if whatever had been out there had disappeared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And then it happened again. This time, it was different. The notification came earlier in the evening, just as the sun was setting. When I checked the footage, the figure was closer, much closer. It was now standing at the edge of the porch, still shrouded in darkness, but unmistakably there. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. I had to do something. But what could I do? I decided to install more cameras around the house, hoping to catch a better glimpse of whatever was lurking outside. I placed one by the front gate, another near the side yard, and one in the backyard, covering every possible angle. That night, I sat in front of my phone, watching the live feed from all the cameras, waiting for something to happen. The hours ticked by, and nothing. No movement, no sounds. It was as if the shadow had vanished for good. But just when I was about to turn off the feed and go to bed, the front camera picked up movement. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was back, and this time, it was closer than ever. The figure stood at the front gate, just outside the reach of the camera's light. It was motionless, its face obscured by the shadows. I could barely make out its shape, but it was tall, much taller than I had expected. I froze, my eyes glued to the screen. The figure didn't move, didn't approach the house. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to call the police, but what would I tell them? That a shadowy figure had been standing outside my house for weeks? I waited, holding my breath, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. The figure stayed there for what felt like hours, unmoving, watching. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Another notification. I sat up, groggy and disoriented, and checked the camera. The figure was gone. I sighed in relief, but it was short-lived. As I scrolled through the footage, I noticed something strange. The figure had moved, but not in the way I expected. It had circled the house. The camera in the backyard had picked up movement as well, something moving past the window. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and ran to the back door. I checked the locks, making sure everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the next few days on edge, constantly checking the cameras, looking over my shoulder. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every little sound, every movement outside made me jump. I was becoming paranoid, but I couldn't help it. The figure didn't return for a while, and I began to think maybe it was over. But then, one night, the camera picked up movement again. This time, it was different. The figure wasn't outside the house. It was inside. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The camera in the hallway showed movement, but the feed was distorted, glitching in and out. I could barely make out the shape of something moving down the hall. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what was happening. I told them there was someone inside my house, but the words felt surreal, like I was talking about someone else. I stayed on the line, listening to the dispatcher's calm voice as I locked myself in the bedroom. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could barely think straight. I kept checking the camera feed, but it was still glitching, showing nothing but static. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of anyone. The officers were polite but skeptical. They didn't find any evidence of a break-in, and the camera footage didn't show anything definitive. I could tell they thought I was overreacting, maybe imagining things. But I knew what I had seen. Something had been inside my house, moving down the hallway. The officers suggested I might want to get some rest, maybe take a break from watching the cameras so closely. I nodded, but I didn't believe for a second that I was imagining things. After they left, I sat in the living room, staring at the camera feed, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me yet. Over the next few nights, the disturbances became more frequent. The camera would pick up movement at random times, sometimes outside, sometimes inside. But every time I checked, the figure was always just out of reach, just beyond the edge of the light. I started to feel trapped in my own home. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police again without sounding crazy, but I also couldn't ignore what was happening. The figure was getting bolder, coming closer each night. I even considered staying somewhere else, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It felt like giving up, like letting whatever this was win. So I stayed, hoping that eventually, it would stop, but it didn't stop. One night, the camera picked up movement again, this time right at the front door. The figure was standing there, just inches away from the camera, its face obscured by shadow. I couldn't see any features, but I could feel it watching me. My hands shook as I watched the footage. The figure didn't move, didn't try to enter the house. It just stood there, silent and still, as if it was waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. My fear had turned to helplessness. I spent the rest of the night staring at the screen, unable to look away. The figure stayed there until just before dawn, then vanished without a trace. I started to avoid the front door, even during the day. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was always there, just out of sight, watching. My friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't explain what was happening. They wouldn't believe me if I told them. I barely left the house anymore. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the figure could appear at any moment. I even thought about getting rid of the camera, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was the only way I could keep track of whatever was haunting me. Days turned into weeks, and the figure continued to show up, always at night, always just out of reach. I was losing sleep, losing my grip on reality. One night, I decided I had had enough. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to know what was going on, even if it meant confronting whatever was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the front door. My heart was pounding as I opened the door and stepped outside. The night was still, the air thick with tension. I shone the flashlight around the porch, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, scanning the yard, the street, the shadows. But no matter where I looked, there was no sign of the figure. It was as if it had never been there at all. I spent hours searching that night, walking around the house, the yard, even down the street. But I found nothing. No figure, no shadow, no strange noises. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the nightmare was over. But as I made my way back to the house, something caught my eye. A movement, just at the edge of the light from the porch. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The figure was there, standing in the shadows, watching me. It was closer now, close enough that I could almost make out its features. But before I could react, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, paralyzed with fear. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go outside anymore. I locked all the doors and windows, closed the blinds, and tried to pretend that the figure didn't exist. But I couldn't ignore it. Every night, the camera would pick up movement. Every night, the figure would come closer, lingering at the edges of the light, waiting for something. I was trapped in my own home, a prisoner to my own fear. I barely slept anymore. The bags under my eyes grew darker, my thoughts more scattered. I couldn't concentrate on anything. All I could think about was the figure, and when it would finally come for me. One night, after weeks of torment, I finally snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and deleted the camera app, hoping that if I couldn't see the figure, it wouldn't exist. For a few days, it worked. I didn't get any notifications, didn't hear any strange noises. It was as if the figure had disappeared. I almost believed that I was free. But then, late one night, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I realized the figure hadn't gone away. It had just gotten inside. I stayed in bed, frozen in fear, listening as the footsteps grew louder. They were right outside my door now, soft but unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The door creaked open, just a crack, and I could feel the figure's presence in the room. It didn't make a sound, but I knew it was there, watching me. My body was paralyzed with fear. I waited, every second stretching into eternity, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, just out of sight, until finally, the door creaked shut again, and the footsteps retreated into the darkness. I never saw the figure again after that night, but I knew it was still out there. Watching. waiting. The doorbell camera was gone, but the fear remained, lurking just beneath the surface. I moved out of that house not long after. I couldn't stay there, not with the memories of what had happened. But even now, in my new place, far away from that house, I still feel it. The sense of being watched, the faint sound of footsteps in the night. Whatever it was, it's still with me. And I don't think it will ever leave.
Story 3.
One evening, I got a notification from my doorbell camera. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I checked the video, I saw a man standing at my door, completely still. What terrified me was his face. It looked blurred, like something was wrong with the camera. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but the longer I watched, the more unsettling it became. He wasn't moving. He didn't ring the doorbell or knock. He just stood there, staring directly at the camera, as if he knew I was watching. I zoomed in, trying to get a better look, but the closer I got, the more his face blurred. It wasn't just out of focus, it was like his features were fading. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? A faceless man was standing outside? I locked all the doors and windows, my heart pounding. He just stood there. No movement, no sound. I turned off the lights, hoping he would leave. But every time I checked the video, he was still there, staring. I couldn't look away. Every time I replayed the video, his face was more distorted. Soon, it was nothing but a dark blur where his features should have been. Minutes passed, and he didn't move an inch. I sat in the dark, terrified, watching him from my phone. The silence was unbearable. Then, suddenly, the video cut off. The screen went black, but the notification didn't stop. I knew he was still out there. I restarted the app, but the camera feed was still black. My phone kept vibrating with new notifications, though. Something was still triggering the motion sensor, even if I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't dare to step outside and check. Instead, I watched the blank screen, waiting for something to happen. My imagination raced with horrible possibilities. Suddenly, the feed flickered back on. The man was gone. But somehow, that made me even more uneasy. Where did he go? And why did he leave without making a sound? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the camera feed. The yard was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The notifications kept coming. The camera insisted there was movement outside, but the video showed nothing. It was like someone, or something, was out of view, just beyond the lens. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I waited for him to come back, but the rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, I checked the footage again, hoping to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or a glitch. But when I watched the video from the night before, something new caught my eye. In the last few seconds of the clip, just before the man disappeared, his head tilted slightly. He was looking directly at the camera. And his face, though still blurred, seemed to form a twisted, unnatural smile. My stomach dropped. It wasn't my imagination. He knew I was watching the whole time. I couldn't shake the image of that distorted smile. It felt like a warning, or worse, a promise that he'd be back. I told myself it was just a malfunction, but deep down, I knew better. For the next few nights, things were quiet. No notifications, no strange figures on the camera. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I could go back to normal. But on the fifth night, just as I was starting to relax, the notification came again. I opened the app, and my blood ran cold. The man was back, standing in the exact same spot. This time, his face was even more distorted. It wasn't just blurred, it was as if his features had melted, leaving a grotesque, formless shape where his face should be. I stared at the screen, frozen with fear. He still wasn't moving. Just standing there, facing the camera, like before. But now, there was something different. His head was tilted, just slightly, as if he was watching me more intently. I slammed the phone down and backed away from the door. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. He was back, and this time, I wasn't sure if he would leave. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? A man with no face was standing outside my house again? It sounded insane. I checked the camera again. He was still there, still motionless. But as I watched, something changed. His head slowly tilted to the other side, almost like he was listening for something. The fear was suffocating. I could barely breathe. I ran to the windows, making sure they were locked, praying he wouldn't try to come inside. Minutes passed like hours. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his presence, as if he was watching me just as intently as I was watching him. Suddenly, the feed flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, his face, or what was left of it, pressed right up against the camera. But it was gone before I could be sure. Then, just like before, the screen went black. The feed cut out again, and my phone was flooded with notifications. I tried resetting the camera, but nothing worked. The screen stayed dark, though the notifications kept coming. It was like he was still there, but just out of reach. I sat in the dark, clutching my phone, too terrified to even move. I listened for any sounds outside, footsteps, tapping, anything. But all I heard was silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. But even in my sleep, I couldn't escape him. I dreamed of that blurred face, that twisted, unnatural smile. The next morning, I woke up in a cold sweat. The house was quiet, but the fear hadn't left me. I checked the camera again, dreading what I might find. To my relief, the footage from last night was blank. There was no sign of the man, no strange movements. But as I scrolled through the notifications, something caught my eye. In one of the last videos, just before the feed cut out, I saw it, his shadow, stretching across the porch, as if he had moved closer to the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. Every night, I checked the camera, half expecting him to return. But the days passed, and he didn't come back. I thought it was over. Maybe he had finally gone, or maybe it had all been some sort of twisted prank. But deep down, I knew better. A week later, just when I had started to relax, the notifications started again. This time, though, the camera didn't show anyone at the door. It was blank, but I knew he was there. I kept watching the empty screen, waiting for something to happen. The notifications wouldn't stop. They came every few minutes, one after the other, but the video showed nothing. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a soft tap at the window. My heart stopped. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera again, but the porch was still empty. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I was too scared to move. Whatever it was getting closer. I forced myself to look out the window, but I couldn't see anything. The tapping had stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. I checked the camera again, praying the man hadn't returned. The feed was still empty, but the notifications kept coming. Something was out there, even if I couldn't see it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them everything. They said they'd send someone, but I knew by the time they arrived, he would be gone. The police came, checked the area, and found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone being there. They told me it was probably just kids playing a prank, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Every night, I stayed up, waiting for the notifications to come. And every night, they did. One night, as I sat watching the empty camera feed, I heard something that chilled me to the bone, a voice, whispering my name from just outside the door. I froze. It was faint, barely audible, but I knew what I had heard. Someone was outside, calling for me. I checked the camera, but it still showed nothing. The voice came again, soft and insistent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. My hands shook as I clutched my phone, staring at the blank screen. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in danger. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't going to leave this time. The voice stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Suddenly, the camera flickered. For a brief moment, I saw a shadow move across the screen. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. I jumped up and locked every door and window in the house. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to leave this time. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching my phone, too terrified to even look outside. The notifications kept coming, one after another, but I didn't dare check the camera again. The tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. It was coming from all around the house, like someone, or something, was circling me, waiting for me to make a move. I was trapped. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew he wasn't going to leave until he got it. The tapping stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was silent again. I held my breath, waiting for what would come next. Then, without warning, the doorbell rang. My heart leaped into my throat. I checked the camera one last time, praying it would show nothing. But there he was, standing at the door, closer than ever.